Hey guys, my apologies. I'm getting this to you a day later than I wanted to. I was filming last night and I wasn't happy with it. Got a fresh night's sleep. I'm sitting in some random classroom in Roberts, and we are going to talk about digital addiction and dark design patterns. And the subtitle of that is Don't Be a UXA money sign, money sign. And my subtitle is Unless You're Cool with That and You Want the Money sign, money sign. And we're going to actually start by talking about business models before we get into dark design patterns, because I think that's really important and will influence or speak to that subtitle. First of all, just some guiding questions that we're going to kind of run through as we think about this. First, why is it a problem? That's where we'll talk about the business models, the incentive for having people be addicted to apps. What even is the problem? So, like, what is digital addiction? What are dark design patterns? And then what should be done? And I will say, just throughout all of this, I am not a researcher in this field. So I'm going to give research influenced conjecture and food for thought questions. And my hope for you is to posit those questions or think about those questions and just have your own opinions about these things. There is a lot of subjectivity in this particular area, and it is a field that is evolving rapidly. Like in the last 10 years, the business model has changed and digital addiction rates have changed. And so, my hope is that you just kind of think about, where do I stand on this issue? So, first food for thought question: where do big software companies in 2021 get most of their revenue, especially companies whose service is free? So we're not the first to ask this question. There's actually kind of a funny Senate hearing from 2018 that was related to Cambridge Analytica in the 2016 election, but a senator asked this question basically to Mark Zuckerberg. And so quickly, let's watch it.
We believe that we need to offer a service that everyone can afford, and we're committed to doing that.
Well, if so, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see. That's great.
So Mark there is putting things pretty simplistically. Netflix came out with a great docudrama called The Social Dilemma. I would highly recommend it, and I wanted to show a clip from that as well, but turns out that Netflix recognizes when OBS is recording and blacks out their screen. So we're going to listen to a quick audio file from that. But if you have Netflix, you should watch The Social Dilemma. It's super relevant to what we're talking about here. So let's listen.
Companies like Google and Facebook are some of the wealthiest and most successful of all time. They have relatively few employees. They just have this giant computer that rakes in money, right? Now, what are they being paid for? That's a really important question.
So I've been an investor in technology for 35 years. The first 50 years of Silicon Valley, the industry made products, hardware, software, sold them to customers. Nice, simple business. For the last 10 years, the biggest companies in Silicon Valley have been in the business of selling their users.
It's a little even trite to say now, but because we don't pay for the products that we use, advertisers pay for the products that we use. Advertisers are the customers. We're the thing being sold.
The classic saying is, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. A lot of people think, oh, well, Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing and see their photos. But what they don't realize is they're competing for your attention. So, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, companies like this, their business model is to keep people engaged on the screen.
When you think about how some of these companies work, it starts to make sense. There are all these services on the internet that we think of as free, but they're not free. They're paid for by advertisers. Why do advertisers pay those companies? They pay in exchange for showing their ads to us. We're the product. Our attention is the product being sold to advertisers.
That's a little too simplistic. It's the gradual, slight, imperceptible change in your own behavior and perception that is the product. And that is the product. It's the only possible product. There's nothing else on the table that could plausibly be called the product. That's the only thing there is for them to make money from.
All right. So I was on the left there blocking out some titles. Now I'm on the right. We should be all good. But, just to put it simply, like, what is the business model of big tech? Well, it's a lot of things, but importantly for this lecture, the business model of software companies over the last decade incentivizes the amount of time a user is interacting with the software, not just the number of downloads or applications sold. Right? So your revenue is based on frequency of use and not just on products sold, which is fundamentally different than a lot of other companies. But that leads us to what I would say is like the thesis of this lecture. Digital addiction does not happen by accident. It happens by design. And that those designs are what we're referring to as dark designs. And maybe I'm wrong about this because something like going way back to the 70s when Pac-Man came out, an arcade style video game would actually be generating revenue based on frequency of use. Like that every time you put a quarter in to play, you're making more money. It's not like you can just put one quarter in and then play Pac-Man whenever you want. But I would argue, in total conjecture here, I don't know if I'm right or wrong about this, I would argue that the creators of Pac-Man weren't like, let's get people addicted to this. So maybe in the beginning, digital addiction started to happen by accident, but over time, it's become recognized, incentivized, and therefore now it's happening by design. Okay, so what are the benefits of having habit-forming products? Why would a company want people to be addicted? I would ask you to kind of think about that question yourself, generate your own list. Like specifically, what good comes from someone being addicted to Instagram or addicted to Fortnite? And then here's my list. So we'll just run through these quickly. Habit-forming products allow companies to sell your attention on their product to advertisers. That's probably the biggest one in the modern business model of software. Charge a premium price, have a competitive advantage, increase growth through network effects, like tell your friends, increase customers' lifetime value. That's big with something like a subscription service where you're paying not once up front, but per month, like Adobe does now with Photoshop and Illustrator. Outrageous. And then increase revenue through things we call microtransactions. That's where a game might be free or you buy the game and then you're able to buy add-ons or extensions. So you see that concept of microtransactions a lot in video games. So we just talked about the business models, like why is there an incentive for having people addicted to products? But now as we dive into what actually is happening, what is digital addiction, it's important to start out by just talking about the dopamine theory of addiction, which comes originally from substance abuse, but is just as applicable in software addiction. So yeah, we'll just run through this quickly. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. That's a chemical messenger. Here's its chemical structure. I won't bore you with the chemistry. But basically, as dopamine is sent from neuron to neuron, that plays a role in how we experience pleasure. Some people call it the happiness molecule. So when events we perceive as good happen or expected to happen, dopamine is released. And you shouldn't necessarily think about this as a binary thing. They're released in different concentrations proportional to the goodness of the event. And now I would just add in that good is a very subjective word, right? So what is good to one person is not necessarily good to another. And this hints at that idea of addiction, like somebody doing a drug, to them it might be good, but to society we'd say it's bad. Same with like checking Instagram every 5 minutes. That might be good to you, but to your parents or to a teacher it might seem bad. So good is just a super subjective word. Let's keep that in mind. The recurrence of these events creates this feedback cycle that makes us seek out the events again. And physiologically, this is the basis for rewarding behavior and forming habits, right? So we have now broken ourselves down we've reduced ourselves to this chemical vessel. And we've talked about how just chemical being sent in response to an activity or in anticipation of an activity is creating habit-forming behaviors, right? We seek out that activity again. So food for thought, I would say, how do you think dopamine may have helped our species evolve? I would say that this is actually a pretty heavily researched field. Evolutionarily, dopamine has been huge for us because it's allowed us to be rewarded for things that are beneficial to us, the individual, like eating food, or to us, the species, like having sex. So dopamine was huge in kind of getting us out of the animal world and becoming humans, because now we have this feedback cycle that will reward good behavior. However, the dopamine driven feedback loop is also the basis for addiction. And that is the actual kind of formal term. If you look through medical literature, they call it the dopamine driven feedback loop. So this entire slide is a lot of food for thought, but the general idea here is that software design patterns intentionally leverage the dopamine-driven feedback loop to promote addiction to products. And a quick Google search will give you a bunch of scary statistics about digital addiction, but the one that I think is most interesting on this particular infographic would be that 75.4% consider themselves addicted to their phones. So let's just run through some food for thought. This is personal reflection for all of you, not something that you need to share, but important to consider nonetheless. So do you believe you're addicted to your phone? What about your computer or your video game console? If so, are some applications better at getting your attention than others? Even if you say no to all of the above, would someone else close to you say differently? And do you take any intentional actions to try to mitigate your interactions with software? Again, just think about those things. I would answer yes to more than I am comfortable with at times. But I do say that I have disabled notifications on most, but not all apps, because notifications, as we'll talk about in a little bit, are a huge trigger to trying to get your attention. And get you into that dopamine feedback. Okay, so what is the goal of dark designs? The goal is to form habitual behaviors. And habitual behaviors can be good or bad. It's kind of like a neutral term. Addiction would be a habitual behavior that society views as bad. So the goal is to get you into the habit zone. And how you get there is by making a product that is used frequently and seemingly better than any of the competition. So you can see on this graph over here, you could kind of play to one of those factors more than the other, but when you have both of them in synergy, that is when a product will become the most addictive. So something like searching on Google, there's lots of search engines out there, but because you're using Google all the time, that could be just a product in which you are habituated to. In kind of the other end of the spectrum, shopping on Amazon, there's lots of ways that you can shop online, and you might not shop online all the time, but Amazon is the most convenient. And so Amazon is the one that you habitually turn back to. And I would say that perceived utility influences frequency. So it's not like these are two independent variables. I view this as frequency to some degree depends upon the perceived utility. So, food for thought. What products can you think of that live in the habit zone? I think you can make an easy mapping of this to video games as well, but think about it. All right, so we talked about how we want people to be habituated to using our products by thinking they're better than other products and using them all the time. But kind of what is the overall model for how to get people hooked on products, how to build habit-forming products? And this model comes from this book called Hooked that Dr. Stanley recommended to me, but I will say upfront, I have not had time to read it. I am curious to read it. In particular, I'm curious to kind of see what the tone is in the book, if it's making a case for building more habit-forming products, or if it's trying to identify what the dark design pattern is and then make a case against it. I don't know, but that's the book, Hooked. Check it out. Here's the model, and the model is what I want to run through because this is kind of what we can then map to specific products. So The model works pretty simply. First of all, there's an internal trigger that's an intrinsic need that the product satisfies. And then there's an external trigger that's the product doing something to remind you of that need. And then there's an action. It's a behavior that the product allows you to do to try to fill that need. A reward, often a variable reward, like you don't know if you're going to get it or not, like gambling. So the product will give you a response in return to that action, and it should feel good. It should release dopamine. But was it good enough? I don't know. I want more dopamine. So then you want to do it again. And then at that point, they do something that makes you come back, and the cycle starts to loop on itself. And that last piece is called investment. So we're going to run through each of these steps quickly and kind of map them to an example using Facebook. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about these through an example of Facebook, kind of talk about that whole the hooked cycle. So I went into my Facebook and I grabbed an interaction that occurred about a month ago that to me I think maps really well to this cycle of what Facebook's doing. So the first step, remember, was triggers. There are two types of triggers, but a trigger in general will actuate a behavior, it'll cause it. So internal triggers are positive or negative emotions like loneliness, happiness, fear of missing out, boredom, yada, yada, yada. It's kind of those humanistic needs that we have. And the apps will prey upon those needs. And then external triggers are embedded with information which tells the user what to do next. So that would be like a notification is an external trigger. So I have a need inside me, and then an external trigger is going to pop up on my screen and say, hey, fill that need. And so here is an example. And actually, I guess before I get into that, here's a model of kind of triggers in addiction theory. So a trigger would be influenced by your motivation to fill that need and the ability, the easiness, if you will, of kind of filling that need. So let's go through this example real quick. So my need, my internal trigger is that, especially in COVID, and this is the first time I've ever lived away from my parents over this last year. So I have been missing my family a lot. And so that is kind of this internal trigger or emotion that I have inside me. And I think it's particularly strong at this kind of point in my life. And so then 4 weeks ago, I get this external trigger, which is a notification from my cousin, who he's my oldest of all my cousins, and I pretty seldomly talk to him, but he is family. And I get this notification from Facebook, and it just says a beautiful photo of my cousin, that's me, my cousin's wedding. And so how am I not going to click on that, right? Like, that is a pretty powerful trigger. And that's one other thing that I'll add here is social media in particular doesn't create the content. They create the space for the content, and then the users create the content. And so in particular in that loop, like, the part of the genius or the nefariousness of social media is that they create the space for that loop to occur, and then the users create the content to fill in that loop. And I just think that's fascinating. So anyways, moving on to the next step. So the action. Action is the result of a trigger to increase the chances of users returning to the product. The product should be easy to use, and there should be actions taken in anticipation of a reward. So remember, I'm feeling lonely. I miss my family. I get this notification, a beautiful photo of my cousin's wedding in Maine. How am I not going to click on that? So I click on it. I take action. Boom, I'm in the app. That's what they want. Here's the photo, which I think is funny. Yes, this is from my wedding, but you can see my cousin photoshopped in Bernie's mitten meme. So this must have been right around the 2020 and 2021 inauguration. And at this point, like, I have to respond to this. I can't not respond to this. Like, he took time to Photoshop in Bernie sitting next to me at my wedding. So I had to say something, right? And so I say something in anticipation of starting a conversation, right? Of interacting with my family. So that would be the reward that I am anticipating. All right, so now here we are at the reward and investment stages of the loop. So variable rewards are one of the most powerful tools that companies use to hook users. These rewards create a craving and curiosity in users, and introducing variability multiplies the effects associated with wanting and desire. So remember, I wanted to talk to my family. I get a notification from a family member, and now I make a comment. Excuse me, that's my action. And so now I'm like waiting to see like what other family members are going to chime in on this. Right, so that's my anticipation of a reward. And research shows that levels of dopamine surge when the brain is expecting a reward. And if the reward works, then often the user will follow up to achieve or attempt to achieve that reward again. And that's what leads to investment, right? That's what creates that dopamine driven addiction feedback loop. And increasing the user engagement and the user investment in the product, which in turn increases the chances of users getting back to the product often. And an investment example could be time, money, inviting friends, stating preferences, building virtual assets, and learning to use new features, right? So then you're just like invested in the product, you're exploring the product, you're spending more time on the product, and i.e. you're hooked. So through consecutive hook cycles, the product could reach their ultimate goal of bringing users back again and again without depending on costly advertising and marketing, right? You have created a product where the product itself is hooking, is capturing the users. So in my example, right, missing my family, I get a notification from a family member, I take action, I open the app, I comment on it, how could I not? And then of course, I'm expecting some response. And so Mark, my cousin, responds with a picture from my brother's wedding. And then my mom responds with a comment as well. And, it's like now you've got my mom involved. You're like satisfying this very internal need of me just like talking to my mom. I'm hooked. And that conversation went on and actually became quite a big little thread. But anyways, that's my example on Facebook of how the hook cycle applies. I think you could easily kind of map that to most modern software products, especially video games too. Like, so food for thought. I don't have this written down, but like think about, especially if you play video games, how might the hook cycle map to video games? And now I want to take just a minute longer to talk about some even darker design patterns. That's like my phrase, I'm coining that. That's not necessarily something you'll see out there. But darker design patterns are ones that go beyond basic manipulation. They're not preying upon my human instinct so much as just trying to deceive me. So now we're talking about deceit. And so some places where outright deceit might occur in software is in the fine print, like whoever actually reads the fine print. In quote unquote free trials. So here on this app, you can see free for 3 days and then it's $50 a week. Like, I don't know what this app is, but $50 a week. So free trials where you don't read the fine print, you don't know when you're going to get billed are, I think, a darker design pattern where it's almost a little deceitful. Some would argue like, well, just do your homework. And I'd add into this piece, I don't know if anyone's been on a subscription service with an iPhone, but finding where in the settings to cancel the subscription is also surprisingly difficult. So I don't know if Apple intentionally does that or not, but I think that's a little deceitful as well. Screen manipulation, like making the X on an advertisement super tiny or putting 2 X's and only one of them works. Virtual objects. So here in this Snapchat ad, they put a piece of hair there, and that makes you think that there's actually hair on your screen, and you go to wipe the hair away, but really you're clicking on the ad. Like, this is pretty low, kind of skeezy way to get somebody to click on an ad. So I know that list wasn't comprehensive, so I would just ask food for thought, what outright deceitful tactics have you seen in software promotion? All right, so we're nearly to the end. I have no idea how long this is going to be until I actually stitch all this video together, but I hope it's under 20 minutes. But I do think it's important. Like, we've talked about why companies want you addicted to their products. We've talked about how they get you addicted to their products. And all of this is with this connotation that this is bad. But the nihilistic millennial in me wants to just say, wait a minute, let's hit the pause button. I've got a new guiding question. Is this even a problem? Right? And so this is where I would just put it on you as a point of personal reflection. Think about digital addiction. Like, is it a problem? I think we could all agree that substance abuse is a significant problem in this country. And I'm sure many of us have tragic personal stories that they could share about how they've seen substance abuse affect individuals, communities. But when we talk about digital addiction, there's often this analogy made of between substance abuse and digital addiction. And I would just like to come right out and say that like Instagram is not the same as a gram of heroin. Playing Call of Duty is not the same as doing cocaine, right? So substance abuse in my mind is far worse than digital addiction. But that doesn't answer the question of, is digital addiction a problem? Some of you might say yes, some of you might say no. It creates amazingly interesting debate that I've seen in high school classrooms. So let's start to evaluate this new guiding question quickly. So, food for thought, is it a problem? So I guess the researcher in me would say, well, if I want to evaluate if something's a problem, I'm going to turn to the experts. So let's look at kind of the medical literature. There's 2 books that I looked at for this, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, that's called the DSM-5. It's published by the APA, which you've probably heard of because of their citation standards, but they also do psychiatric research. And in the DSM-5, there is no mention of general digital addiction. In 2013, the DSM-5 found insufficient evidence to classify internet gaming disorder, that was the phrase they used, as a mental health disease and placed it in a category of concern for future research. But they have not declared digital addiction or even gaming addiction as a disease. And then the ICD-11, which is kind of another standard on mental health disorders, is the International Classification of Diseases, 11th edition, published by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they do recognize gaming disorder as a mental health disease. But the caveat is that that came in the drafting of the 11th edition in 2019. It's not going to be published until later this year or next year. So technically, these 2 chief authorities used worldwide on how to recognize and declare a mental health disease are only beginning to recognize gaming disorder, and there's no mention of like general digital addiction or social media addiction, which I think is kind of interesting. And if you're a gamer, you might disagree with that. Why are we getting the bad rap? But that's where the medical literature is at today. But now let's think about this one step further. Like, how could we even measure this? And so talking about subjective and objective metrics for research, subjectively, I would say this is probably the messiest topic that you could try to measure subjectively. And what I mean by that is it's really hard to ask an addict or even a loved one if they're addicted. So don't send out a survey and say, are you addicted to your phone? Because people have a tendency to not be honest when they're asked about personal things that they're uncomfortable with. But objectively, and I'm not going to go through this list because I think I'm running out of time, I want to put it to you, food for thought. How would you measure addiction objectively? What as a researcher might you look for? And these things are being looked for when you use an app. Like there's like some wrapper program that is studying how you use the app and seeing if you're hooked or not, and then making changes based on that. So like, what are those things, say on Instagram or Call of Duty? What are those things do you think that they might be looking for to measure your addiction to the app? And then I'd say, we're like, really, this is too simplistic. There are 2 research questions here about, is this a problem? Is digital addiction a problem to the individual, right? So you can study a single person and say, are they addicted and what impacts does that have on their lives? But then there's also a secondary question that is digital addiction a problem to society? So not how does it impact that individual's lives, whether or not they're addicted, but how is mass addiction to technology impacting society as a whole? And they're fundamentally very different questions, and I hope you can see that fundamental difference. And just food for thought, don't have to write anything down, but in your head kind of think like what research might we want to do to answer both of those questions? What data might we want to collect? And this is a very open field of research. Like as we saw in the last slide with mental health disease classification, like this stuff is evolving by the minute. So those are two very active areas of research that you might even want to get involved in. All right, so here we are at the last slide, I swear. How do we move forward? And I've got up here this economic spectrum, and you might be thinking like, what the heck? And you know, it's got some buzzwords in the middle, like socialism, communism, capitalism. Like, don't worry about the buzzwords so much. But I do think this framing is important. And I will also say that question, how do we move forward? I have no answers for it. I don't think we collectively as a society have answers for that. I think this is the question that we will see fleshed out in the next 10 years. And so to get ahead of that conversation, let's just consider the question now. Like I said, this is an economic spectrum. On one end, businesses are free to do as they please. That would be the capitalism end. And you know, at its most extreme, we call that laissez-faire capitalism, where there are no regulations of businesses. And then on the other end, businesses are told exactly how to act by the government. That would be the communism end. And so I'm going to leave you with this last food for thought, a question that we as Americans and as a world are trying to figure out together right now in the 21st century. If it is known that businesses are exploiting our human nature to make products addictive, to what extent should the government, and I'm thinking from the standpoint of a democracy, the government is the will of the collective people, to what extent should the people intervene to regulate that exploitation? Again, that is the question of kind of the decade that I think we will see a lot of movement on. So, in conclusion, I hope you found this interesting. I hope it wasn't too long. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry it's getting up a day later, but yeah, as general, shoot me email if you have any questions, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.